Welcome everyone, Costin here with a campaign overview guide for the Empire within the Empire, so Karl, Franz, and Balthsar Gelt. To talk about the Empire as a faction, as a race, some of the things you should be concerned about in terms of their army, their lords, their legendary lords, and their overall strategic situation. One of the things that I will emphasize when playing a Total War campaign is you should always think about your plans. Your early game plans, your mid game plans, your late game plans. One tool that can really help you out in terms of planning a campaign is the Toggle Fog of War. I would only use this on turn 1 and I would just look at the starting situation of every single faction like here to understand what I'm going to be dealing with, what are the issues, what are the threats, how important are those threats, and what should I do in response to them. Now, when it comes to these various threats, I will focus on the early game, mid game, and even late game when I talk about Karl, Franz, and Gelt specifically, because they are different in terms of the things they care about. But you always want to have a plan. You always should think about, what am I going to do 10 turns from now, 20 turns from now? How is my campaign going to be looking, and how much should I care about certain factions in my dealings with them, be it diplomatic dealings or conquering them outright? And those are some of the things you should be mindful of. And always remember that on a high difficulty specifically, it doesn't matter how predisposed AI might be in favor of you, like the dwarves are friendlier towards the Empire as an example. The Empire, the AI will always be biased against you. It will be difficult to make deals, it will be difficult to avoid wars, and so on and so forth. So just always be mindful of that. Now, the Empire is a mediocre faction overall. They have a good economy, they have good control, good public order, but they do struggle because of their armies. So if we look at the buildings, you can see that the weaving house, and that can be made into the Tailor's Guild, can produce a great deal of income, or a pretty decent amount of income. Then you've got good growth for the fields, and then good control through the tavern chain. You can also get benefits to corruption, and also increase your hero capacity by quite a bit through the Shrine of Sigmar, the Altar of Conclave, or just the Wizard's Tower, for a level 3 barracks with Imperial Captains. And the one problem that does exist when it comes to hero capacity is going to be with Witch Hunters, which brings me to the second point, the hero choices. Captains are pretty decent, but they're not going to be absolute killing machines in a battle. They're just decent tanks, decent line holders, decent buffers because of the abilities they have, like Encourage, for instance. But they're not going to be able to win a battle on their own, like some heroes for certain factions can do. For many factions, in point of fact, this is one of the problems the Empire faces, because they're going to be dealing with those factions. Witch Hunters are not particularly great in combat, because ranged heroes and lords are not especially great in a combat situation, but they can be good from a survivability perspective, debuffing perspective, and post-battle loot options. Warrior Priests are great because of the replenishment benefit that they provide, as well as the various AoE abilities that they do have, or the one AoE ability they do have, which is Soulfire, and they can do a great deal of damage with that on units that clump up on them. And then Wizards, of course, Wizards and their magic, certainly force modifier on the battlefield. When it comes to lore choices, again, they're just mediocre, really. Arch-Lectors are basically Warrior Priests, but as a lore choice. Generals of the Empire, basically Imperial Captains. And Huntsman Generals are kind of like Witch Hunters in a sense, in terms of their battlefield potential. Arch-Lectors, I would argue, are the best because of their AoE ability, though Generals of the Empire can be a bit more durable than they are. They also have better mount choices. And Huntsman Generals are pretty bad from the perspective of their combat potential, but they do have some benefits that shouldn't be ignored, specifically in the skill line over here, which gives them benefits for their army, for spearmen, halberdiers, greatswords, range for huntsmen and archers, and then also campaign movement range and casualty replenishment. So they're more of a support lord that with some campaign benefits. Just bear that in mind. They're not so great in a stand-up fight.
Bring me to my men.
With regards to the Imperial Army, here's something you should be aware of. Until Tier 3, the Imperial Army is pretty weak. The units from Tier 1 and Tier 2, they're just not really that great. The reason they're not so great is, even though archers and crossbowmen can do a decent amount of range damage, that's really all you're going to get from this. The problem with spearmen with shields, halberdiers, swordsmen, spearmen, Free Company militia is, if we look at their stats, we can see that they don't have the best leadership available, and more importantly, they all have relatively weak armor. Though, of course, the shielded units are shielded, so they can block a certain amount of missile fire. The problem is, of course, that weak armor and that weak leadership will affect them in a fairly significant way in battles, be it battles that you fight manually or battles that you fight in auto-resolve. And they have neighbors like the Greenskins, the Vampire Counts, the Warriors of Chaos, the Norskins, who have significantly better units much earlier on. So if we look at Franz here, he has some Imperial Secessionists, but then he has Vlad, he has Festus, he has Draika, and then of course he has Azag over here to tackle one way or another. And all of those can recruit far better units than you can much earlier on. However, the Empire, although it starts out very weak, especially in Tier 1 and Tier 2, by Tier 3 things start improving with Huntsmen and with Greatswords. So the downside is of course needing the armory building to be able to get them, but the armory will give you local recruitment capacity and recruit rank, so it's generally beneficial to have one, at least in certain provinces, like the Reichland over here. Then of course you do get better cavalry choices, Knights of the Blazing Sun, Outriders with grenade launchers, mortars, war wagons, though they're pretty crap. They can be a decent distraction in some cases though. And then handgunners. But it's really at Tier 4 that things change. Like at Tier 3 you can get a pretty good range line, but you're going to be lacking cavalry and artillery. But at Tier 4 you get Hellstorms, great cannons, which are great for taking out walls, war wagons with mortars, and then of course Demigraph Knights with halberds and without halberds. At Tier 5, the only thing that's really worth looking into at Tier 5 would be the Steam Tank as a pretty decent tank in a battle, though it is a pretty expensive unit to recruit, to maintain, but a couple of these can hold the line like no other unit in your roster can. I would not necessarily bother too much with the regular Reichsguard or Imperial Knights. They're not so great. Instead, in Tier 1 and Tier 2, I would recruit a lot of archers, spearmen with shields, crossbowmen, and then switch to greatswords and huntsmen later on. Handgunners are less than useful, even though they do a good amount of damage. The problem with the gun line is that at the moment, and for a while now, the gun line has struggled because of the way that ranged is handled in Warhammer 3 by the engine. You might have a straight line of fire against an enemy, and your unit just won't shoot. This especially happens with rattling gunners, Jezzails to an extent, handgunners of the Empire, flamers of Tzeentch, other units as well. So your best bet are things like huntsmen, greatswords, crossbowmen, and earlier on archers. But yeah, the Empire army starts weak, gets to a decent spot, not an extraordinarily good spot, but a decent spot later on. One thing to mention though about the Empire that you should be aware of is that since you'll be spending quite a bit of your early campaign at least fighting in Imperial settlements, well, Imperial settlements are designed in such a way that there's a lot of blind spots in them. And so you can attack one of these settlements even though you don't have artillery to breach the walls, because you only get great cannons at Tier 4. Even if you can't destroy the walls, mortars are pretty bad at that. What you can do is park all your ranged units outside of the walls in a blind spot, and there's significant blind spots in Imperial territory, including in Sylvania and of course the Brass Keep. There's a lot of blind spots where you can do a significant amount of damage without taking any in return. The Brass Keep is a bit of an exception to this, but even then there's still some blind spots over there where you can just shoot all your ammunition, take no damage in return. And this is where the fact that Vampire Counts, Warriors of Chaos are melee focused factions really starts to bite them, especially when controlled by the AI. Some of the things to bear in mind there. Another thing, and this is pretty crucial, And one thing you want to avoid in the late game in particular, or mid to late game. Obviously, the early game will be focused on getting as much territory of the Empire as possible. But in the mid to late game, or in the late game in general, there is a particularly nasty trap where you can end up fighting again and again and again over the same territories. And that trap specifically concerns the northern borders of the Empire, Nordland, and also the southern part of Norska. The reason is, this territory is very hard to take, very hard to hold onto, and there's a lot of factions over here. Or if there's not many factions over here, it means that someone like Wulfric has unified Norska, in which case you're in for a nightmare scenario in your campaign. And you just want to avoid falling into this trap. You want to devote as few resources as possible to holding the north, and instead concentrate on expanding to the south. Because you can. There's a lot of territory to expand to the south. You have southern Bretonia, or Bretonia in general. You have Estalia, Tylea, the western border princes. Like, the western border princes is an amazing province. It has 4 regions. You can make it a strong economic hub for your entire empire because they have resources over here, as we can see. So there's resources in Myrmidons, and I think in every territory, well, except Argalis. But every other region, 3 out of 4 regions, have a resource to them, which means that it is very beneficial to take these. And then, of course, the eastern border princes fall in the same category as well. So you're better off doing as little as possible in the north to stabilize the situation against Norska, and then conquering the south. But how do you do that? Well, supporting Kislev can help out, or making a deal with Ungrim, giving him a straight line between his territory and Norska, and watch him take on Norska, because surprisingly the dwarves can be pretty good against Norska, especially in Ostresolv. Like in one campaign I played as Kislev, I gave Ungrim a lot of territory all the way to Norska, the minor territories, and he just conquered straight up half of Norska, relieving a lot of the pressure I was feeling in that campaign. And you can do something similar in an Imperial campaign. Or you can make deals with Costalton and Catherine and have them hold the line while you're busily expanding your territory to the south. So try and expand south, stabilize north, expand south. Don't fall into the trap. I have fallen into this trap many times in many campaigns, playing as Kislev, playing as the Empire, and it will just slow down your campaign by a significant margin. Though, of course, an Imperial campaign is always going to be slower than many other campaigns. The reason behind this is you want to take control of the Empire. The reason you want to take control of the Empire directly, or most of it, not just because many of the provinces are actually really good. For instance, Midland, Talabekland, 4 region provinces, Ostermark, 4 region provinces, 4 region provinces, Reichland, another one, 4 region provinces, and then, of course, the gold mine in southern Sylvania. And even places like Stirland and northern Sylvania are pretty decent from an economic output. So you want to take these for their raw economic output, and you also want to take these because of the various benefits of the electric counts, the state troopers, the rune fangs or other items, and the electric count title for whichever lord or legendary lord you assign it to. For instance, Karl Franz starts as the electric count of Reichland, so he gets 10% research rate, recruit rank for Imperial Knights, and upkeep minus 5%. Though every electric count is going to get that minus 5% upkeep for electric count state troopers. But here's something to bear in mind when you're dealing with all these Imperial factions. You can't just declare war on them and take their territory, because it will affect your Imperial authority, and if Imperial authority drops too much, well, not only will the other electric counts all declare war on you, but you will also suffer significant penalties in growth, control, income, and leadership. And your leadership is already in a trouble spot, so you don't want it to drop by 5. That will hurt you by a significant amount. So the Imperial campaign is all about balancing this out. There are several ways of doing it. There are certain events where you can spend the prestige which you gain from battles, taking and holding territory. There are some events where you can spend that to gain Imperial authority, but then there's one particular event to bear in mind. This event concerns a situation where one electric count takes territory that rightfully belongs to another. So, say for instance here, Festus will take Crudenwald pretty quickly in a campaign. Then let's say Midland comes around and takes it back, right? Generally speaking, what will happen in the situation if Midland takes Crudenwald is an event will pop up, and if you force Midland at the cost of fealty to give it back to Hochland, then you will gain 1 Imperial Authority. And this is something you can abuse. For instance, I can take Crudenwald myself, trade it to Midland, and the event may trigger. I've seen some issues sometimes where it doesn't trigger, but more often than not, it is a good way of cheesing the Imperial Authority system. So you get this benefit of economy and growth, and also a chance to increase elector count fealty. Fealty is something that honestly you could do an entire video on, but suffice to say, the better your diplomatic relations with an elector count, the more fealty you may get, the more you give territory back to them, the more you help them out, more fealty that you get. And once you get to 10 fealty with an elector count, they'll offer to confederate with you, or you can refuse it and get 1 Imperial Authority. If you accept it, you have to pay a free Imperial Authority cost. So your expansion is going to be slow because of that. If you declare war on an elector count, just outright seize their territory, that's going to cost you a great deal in Imperial Authority. And I think it might cost you twice. Once for declaring the war, the second time if you take their capital, that's an additional cost in Imperial Authority. Yeah, it needs a change to the entire system. But the problem with Imperial Authority is the limitations it imposes on diplomacy, not just between you and the other elector counts, but between each other. So for instance, Talabecland over here starts in a relatively strong position, but they have a neighbor in Festus. Here's the problem though, because Talabecland can't get a military alliance with yourself or with Hochland or with Midland, chances are by the time they are dealing with Festus, it's actually Festus that has declared war on them, and he's raising Talabium to the ground. The limitation on diplomacy genuinely hurts the Empire, and it's just something you're going to have to work around. You can't get the defensive alliance, they can't get the defensive alliance between each other, so you can't replenish troops in their territory, unless you're talking specifically about Franz, who has a trait to deal with that. But generally speaking, without the defensive alliance, you can't replenish in territory of someone you just have military access with. For instance, I can get the trade agreement, military access, and non-aggression pact with Talabium, but that's all that I'm going to get here.
Indeed.
I can't build an outpost. I can't give an order to them. So the limitations genuinely hurt the Empire. Honestly, I wish the entire Imperial Authority system, or this limitation in diplomacy, should be removed completely from the game. Hopefully an Imperial rework is going to be coming. At that point, I'll probably have to do this video all over again. But as it stands right now, it is a fairly limited system, and you just have to work around it. And it is going to slow you down, because you can only gain confederations with these factions if you achieve 10 fealty. And even then, you may not have the Imperial Authority to accept it, and you might have to wait more turns for them to offer it again, assuming you haven't lost any fealty. The only exception to this is with Marienburg, and only with a recent patch, and Marienburg doesn't particularly like you as either Franz or Balthsar Gelt. So just a number of things to keep in mind. But just remember, you have to worry about the entire empire, because if you're losing elector counts, your Imperial Authority is going to go down. You want to keep that high. You have to defend the borders of the entire empire, and you're herding cats, as Mandalore Gaming put it. So with all of that said, let's talk about the legendary lords themselves, Franz and later on Balthsar Gelt. Franz gets campaign movement range, extra lord recruit rank, more prestige, and benefits to diplomatic relations with the Empire. The prestige is kind of meaningless because outside of the very early game where you can use it for certain events, once you get past like 2000, 3000, it feels redundant in a lot of ways. You can use it for diplomatic relations, to improve relations between various factions or decrease relations if you so desire, but because of the limitations in diplomacy between the elector counts, it's not too significant. So it's really the Lord Recruit rank and the campaign movement range that matter over here. On top of that, he does get benefits in terms of replenishment to neutral territory, which is useful given the fact that you can't get those defensive alliances, military alliances. So this will allow his army to replenish while going for Imperial count territory and beyond when you're looking to conquer more territory later down the line. He also gets the Guardian ability for Great Swords and Reichsguard. I'd say this is more useful for the Great Swords because it gives them, within a 35-meter radius, 15% physical resistance, which can be pretty useful. On top of that, more Lord recruit rank for his special skill line, experience, benefits to Reichsguards, Great Swords, Imperial Captains, recruit rank and capacity, upkeep benefit and recruit rank, and weapon strength. So we're looking at quite a bit of experience benefits and recruit rank benefits. Some benefits, the biggest one being the Great Sword one, though it's not actually as good compared to what Gelt gets, because Gelt can get plus 19 armor to all units in his armies. But I'll get into that in just a bit. He, of course, also has Golem Miraz, Beast Slayer, Silver Seal. So he does have some nice benefits, specifically the control benefit, because you're looking at 2 control in all provinces. Now, talk about Franz's situation. Like, he's a decent melee fighter, though he doesn't hold a candle to someone like Vlad or Isabella. He's more useful in terms of a supporting role in battles. But let's talk about the situation. Within the first few turns of the campaign, 5-6 turns, what you'll want to do is take out the Imperial rebels, the Imperial secessionists. The reason you want to do so, beyond just securing the territory very quickly, is you want to prevent a faction like, say, Marienburg from looking at Eilhart and saying, oh, I'm just going to take that from the secessionists because they're pretty weak. You also want to take Helmgard from the secessionists within those 5-6 turns, but very quickly, regardless. Because it will form the frontier line between your core territory here in Reichland and the south. The reason you want to hold on to Helmgard is you don't have the luxury of expanding beyond the borders of the Empire early on in the campaign. You could go for Southern Bretonia, but if you do so, you're likely, very likely, going to end up in war with Lorem the Punch, and more crucially, and quite likely, the entirety of Lorem. For whatever reason, Orion is very predisposed against you. Every campaign I've played as Franz, he's declared war against me, marched his armies against me. So if you're marching all the way here, and I think the reason is because he wants to take the territories here, and then he ends up next to you, and he's like, oh, Helmgard is an easy picking. It's not, by the way. You can easily defend yourself against Orion and not end up in a war with Durfu, as well as the 2 other minor Wood Elven factions in Lorem, but the bigger problem can be Lorem the Punch. They've changed the situation here, so he doesn't start a war with Paravan, but rather starts a war with Aquitaine. He's very well suited to deal with Aquitaine, and this benefits you if you're playing the Empire, because he is likely going to end up in contact with Elfarion. Elfarion's very likely to declare war against him, and so Grom won't necessarily become a threat to you. But when it comes to the frontier here at Helmgard, the fortress itself can resist a lot of attacks once you take it and replenish the garrison, and once you increase its level, but you might actually have to maintain a small army here, a couple of units, in order to ensure you can defeat against any attack. Ideally for auto-resolve, because if you just auto-resolve it, the entire enemy army gets wiped out. But once you've secured the frontier, one way or another, within the first few turns, what do you want to do? We're still talking the early game, first 10, 20 turns. Well, you want to move north, through Midland. If you can wipe out Kazrak along the way, that's all well and good. If you don't encounter him, if he avoids you, don't necessarily prioritize it too much. What you want to do is prevent either the fall of Hochland or to recapture Hochland from Festus, lay siege to the Brass Keep, and take out. How doable is that? Very doable. Because Festus, he does have a fairly powerful army, but if you throw 30 units, and you can certainly recruit 30 units, a stack and a half, to throw at Festus, he won't necessarily be able to win that battle in open field. He does have a fairly strong army, but you may be able to wipe it out in an open field battle, then replenish in Hochland over here, and then eventually take the Brass Keep. The biggest issue actually over here is the plagues that Festus is going to enable, as well as the corruption of the Brass Keep. But you can certainly lay siege successfully. Taking the walls is going to be difficult. Ideally, you're in a situation where you can out-resolve this battle, but that can be a bit of a problem. It is a level 2 Dark Fortress from the very start. It might end up being level 3 by the time you get there, because of all the benefits the AI gets when it comes to growth and the economic benefits. But you can also lay siege to it and deal a good amount of damage with your ranged units from the blind spots, so you're not taking damage from the wall defenses, or you can drive the enemy from those walls so the defenses are ineffective. Push comes to shove, you could also even use the mortars that you start with to take down one of the wall towers, create a blind spot if need be. By the way, you want to deal with Festus. And then, if you haven't already, deal with Khazrak. So you want to stabilize this entire section of the Imperial border. This will help out the Nordland against the Norskins to the north. I wouldn't be too bothered about dealing with the Black Pit and the Black Pit tribe, because Marienburg, Midland, if you could deal with Khazar quickly enough, and even potentially Hockland and obviously the Wood Elves over here, most certainly will end up in a war with the Black Pit tribe and wipe them out. And you want them to deal with this border. You want to devote as little as possible attention here. If need be, if Nordland ends up under significant pressure, you might want to send some aid. There is the concern of Ostland and how Castalton may declare war on Ostland, or Catherine may declare war on Ostland, if not both. Lore-wise, the reason this happens is because Ostland has poor relations with Kislev. Though a full declaration of war seems unlikely, but I've seen it happen in a lot of campaigns. Generally, they don't take the Wolfenburg unless Festus takes the Wolfenburg. But just be aware that Kislev might create some issues over here. I would strongly recommend not taking this territory for yourself, devoting as little energy as possible. Even if you end up losing a lot of Imperial authority because the Norland and Ostland get taken out, you want to devote your energies elsewhere. Specifically, once Festus is dealt with and Khazrak is dealt with, what you want to really deal with is Vlad. You want to mobilize multiple stacks of troops, 2 full stacks of troops, maybe even 2.5, free if you can afford it, and march to deal with Vlad. By the point you arrive, Vlad is likely going to have wiped out Zufbar, talking here about legendary difficulty, taken the entirety of southern and northern Sylvania, and maybe even taken some territory in Stirland, and maybe even Averheim. Hopefully you arrive before that happens, but you're going to have to take a lot of settlements from them. The one benefit you have here is that the layout of Tempelhof, and Drakenhof really suits you as an attacker with range units, lots of blind spots along the walls, can park your range units outside those walls and kill everything in sight. Zufbar is the hardest to deal with, but it's not going to be the most fortified settlement, even if Vlad does manage to take it. If he does take it, and you take it back, I would potentially be needing to take Grompeak to achieve it, but I would give this territory to Ungrim. Ungrim is a really bad legendary lord for the dwarves to play, but he can be a very useful ally if you're operating in this area. This can even apply to Vlad, that certainly applies to Kislev. And you can even take, and if you do take some territory, let's say if you do decide for whatever reason to send an army here, for instance, in the Western Oblast and Troll Country to help Kislev out, and if you could potentially achieve a direct line of territories from Ungrim's territory to here, he'll work wonders in terms of keeping Cass at bay. But that's more of a mid-game, potentially late-game scenario. One of the things you want to do in your campaign at one point, not necessarily very early on, but one of the things you could benefit from doing is helping Kislev out deal with Azazel and Frost. If you can wipe out either of these, ideally both of these, playing as Karl Franz in the mid-game, this will give Kislev a great deal of freedom to secure the northern frontier of the Empire, while you are busily holding Ostermark and Sylvania. And Ostermark, Sylvania, both northern and southern Sylvania can form the economic bedrock of your empire, with the exception of course, the Reichland. What is the late game looking like for the empire, though? Well, there are several choices over here. You can go into southern Bretonia, though that's likely going to end up sparking a war with the Wood Elves. Though by this point, if you have taken Sylvania, if you have taken Ostermark, I'll go into a bit of detail about Draika and Azag and how to deal with them, but Azag and Draika should not necessarily be a big concern if you've wiped out Festus, Vlad, Kazrak. But you do have the choice of expanding here in southern Bretonia, though I don't necessarily like these provinces. They have resources, but they're 2 region provinces, and they do expose you significantly to Lorem. Potentially a better plan would be to reach the western border princes and even the eastern border princes, take this territory. Assuming Bellegarde hasn't done this already. If he has, you could take over Tylea, eliminate Skavenblack, maybe expand into Estalia. Though not necessarily the mountains province over here. But either way, one expansion path, if you don't want to end up in the vicious circle of constantly fighting in the north, one expansion path for good territory is, of course, in Tylea, western border provinces, and then Sartosa. And from Sartosa, you have a launch pad into Araby. Araby is one of the best regions of the entire game. There's no endgame event here except the Tomb Kings, but that's near the Black Pyramid of Nagash. So basically, this entire province, the land of the assassins, the coast of Araby, they're very safe, very secure, very good provinces. And you can colonize the desert. Funnily enough, you can colonize a lot more than just the desert. All of Khemri is ripe for the taking, and you can even start going into the south. For whatever unknowable reason, and I admit I don't understand this exactly, but for whatever unknowable reason, jungle climate is ideal climate for Karl Franz. He's very far away from a jungle, but realistically, you could just, once you secure the northern part and ensured that it's going to hold, you could just continuously expand south while doing whatever you can to hold the north and take all of this territory for yourself, fighting the Lizardmen, fighting maybe even Teclis along the way, securing all of this territory, and setting up a major empire with a great deal of power. And after that, you could take all of Lustria. Like, I'm just thinking here, very late game in your campaign, like, just expand south, then cross the ocean, start expanding into Lustria. Though that would be a hard fight with a lot of Lizardmen. Because the Lizardmen, generally what happens in these campaigns, Hexoatl becomes a dominant power, and Itza also becomes a very powerful faction. So if you do decide to go down this path, you're going to be fighting the cult of Sotek, you're going to be fighting Itza, and you're also going to likely end up in a war eventually against Hexoatl. But this would give you the maximum amount of territory to expand towards. While, of course, trying to do your best so that the north doesn't collapse. And also getting elector count confederations going via imperial authority along the way. Like some armies devoted here in the north, if you can help Kislev deal with their Azazel and Frat problem, then they can take all of Norsca. Maybe you take some territory in Norsca and then trade it to Kislev. Like you could send an army, a powerful one or multiple armies to take Azazel out, then give that territory to Castalten, and then via sea invasion take the Ice Tooth Mountains and give that also to Castalten. And he will do a great job at keeping everything contained. You don't want to end up fighting Be'lakor, you don't want to end up fighting Wulfric, you want to do as much as possible to avoid that. Though, of course, you're also going to want to maintain the empire together so you don't lose imperial authority. And that's the game plan. Early game, deal with rebels, Festus, Kazrak, then Sylvania. Mid game, Azag, Draika, Ostermark, potentially dealing with Frat and Azazel. And late game, looking to expand over here in Araby and in the jungle, south of Khemri and Araby. That's your game plan. What you do past that, your decision, but you'll have enough money by that point to expand in any territory and hold any territory. So you might even want to pay Archeon a visit. Your victory conditions don't necessarily involve dealing with any faction. They just involve holding all of these territories through either direct control or vassals and military allies. Now let's move on to Balthsar Gelt. Things are a bit different with him. Now looking at Balthsar Gelt, he starts in Solent with the provincial capital of Solent, and he only has a minor enemy to deal with that he can deal with on turn 1, the Black Venom Greenskins. Well, realistically he has 2 enemies. The other one is a tribe of marauding Greenskins, which he can deal with on turn 2. The way you do that is you recruit a lord here in the capital, you recruit 2 units for that lord. In turn 1 you take Steimgart, eliminate the Black Venoms, and then you force march Gelt over here near the capital to deal with the Skull Takers. What they'll do, and I've seen them do this a lot, if you don't declare war on them on turn 1, they'll just move close enough to your capital that an army there, along with Gelt, force marching can just wipe them out very quickly. What do you do after that? Well, there are several things to consider here in this situation. You do have Scrag over here to the south. Scrag is likely going to declare war on you, but he's not going to be foolish enough to attack Fort Sol. Or you should hope he's foolish enough, because he's just going to be wiped out. So your southern frontier should be secure. You may want to get Fort Sol to a rank 2, to a level 2 fortress, and that can repel a significant amount of attacks from Scrag. Just pay attention to him, don't ignore him, he is a problem, and you are going to have to deal with that issue. Another thing to consider is that the dwarves of Karakaren may likely declare war against you as Balthsar Gelt. I think this comes down to the way the AI is coded. The AI does want to expand, but it's not considering the fact that dwarves could just use the underway, take out Scrag's starting region, and eliminate them. Instead, they're more likely to declare war against you. But that's not necessarily an issue for, like, let's say the first 10 turns, and you can also delay it by, say, making a non-aggression pact with the dwarves. You might have to pay them for that, though. They'll certainly like you fighting the Greenskins. Now, after that, one immediate concern after you've secured Solent, eliminated these 2 Greenskin factions, is going to be Sylvania. And here is where things get a bit tricky. You don't get the replenishment of neutral territory like Franz does, so you will want to force march through Averheim, through Stirland. You might take a hit on diplomatic relations because of trespassing, because you're unlikely to get the military access with Averheim. But force march it and take the fort, maybe even take Tempelhof before Vlad arrives, or if Vlad is close by, start laying siege to it. But wait for Vlad to be close. Like, an ideal scenario would be if there's a substantial army in Tempelhof, controlled by Tempelhof, Vlad is about to lay siege to it, and you just fight that battle manually. Vlad takes significant casualties, and then you finish him off. Like, because if you're neutral with Vlad, he will reinforce you to attack Tempelhof. If he, however, takes Tempelhof and is in the settlement, you can wipe him out by using the blind spots along the walls to really take advantage of the lack of range that vampire counts do have. By the way, you want to win that battle. I've done a whole guide on how to win that. I will link that in at the end of this video. I'll also link my guide on how to succeed as Franz within the first few turns of the campaign. But it is very doable. I've done it multiple times. What do you do after? Well, after you have the issue of Draika and Azak. Gelt can colonize mountains. That is a pretty significant advantage. So you could take Azak's starting province, though most likely Ungrum by that point is going to take Azak's capital. But let's talk a bit about Draika and Azak. Here's what happens in the vast majority of campaigns. They end up in a war with each other. Why is that? Well, because they both dislike the Ostermark, they both likely end up in a war with the Ostermark. They're going to wipe out the Ostermark. That is a downside, not going to lie. But once they finish the Ostermark, they're going to likely declare war on each other because they want the same territory, and they don't like each other. Draika generally tends to win those engagements, but it doesn't matter who wins. What's more important is that it leaves both of them vulnerable. So once you've dealt with Vlad, you should have a stack and a half of troops, or maybe even two full stacks that you can get. Certainly Sylvania does have that economic output. Ideally, Vlad would have also wiped out Zofbar for you to take over and use it for your own purposes, and maybe even take Grand Peak to give out to Karkadrin in exchange for a military alliance. Ungrim can be a great military ally. But regardless, you can have these 3 provinces: Central Sylvania, Northern Sylvania, and of course Blackwater. And once you've secured the situation near Sylvania, you want to go against Draika. Ideally, while avoiding having to fight Draika's main army on your own. See, Draika has a stronger army than anyone near her by a lot. She's got fear, she's got terror, she's got lots of nasty abilities. She's an absolute nightmare. The way you deal with Draika is you don't fight Draika directly. You bring so many troops you cannot resolve that battle. Don't fight that battle manually because it will hurt by a lot. You don't want to fight that manually. It will be a very painful battle. But what Draika tends to do is she tends to leave herself very exposed. A lot of her recruitment is dependent on the Griffin Wood. A lot of her economy is dependent on the Griffin Wood. So if she's not here with an army, you can easily take her out. Take out the Griffin Wood, take it for yourself, sack it. Don't just occupy it, sack it, get the money, use it to build more units, use it to build up your economy. And then you may not even have to face Draika's main army on your own either. Maybe it gets wiped out. If you do have to face it on your own, just make sure you have overwhelming advantage and you can just auto-resolve it. If you have to face it in a manual battle, that's going to be a really nasty proposition. Draika is pretty scary. She's one of the few legendary lords where I would genuinely say that fighting her in a manual battle is something that's going to cause gigantic casualties. Unless you bring a vastly superior force. And even then, you can bring 2 full stacks against Draika. She's going to have Treekin. She's going to have uber powerful Treekin. So you don't want to have a fair fight against Draika because she's going to win that fair fight. You want to cheat. And once that's all sorted out, you'll have the Ostermark province, all these 4 provinces, you'll have a strong economic base. After that, you may want to deal with Festus. He's unlikely to just die to Hochland, Midland, and Talabayam. And most of the time, I don't see Karl Franz doing anything very constructive against Festus. So you're quite likely going to have to march through Talabayam territory to deal with Festus. I strongly recommend you do that. Talabayam itself may very well fall to him by this point, and he will have to retake it, give it to Talabayam. Interesting point. If Festus razes Talabayam to the ground, and he has done this, many campaigns I've played, if he does raze it to the ground, you can just reoccupy it and give it to Talabayam for the Imperial Authority for no cost. Bear that in mind. But yeah, with multiple stacks of troops, you should be able to easily deal with Festus. Like, Karl Franz has an early fight against Festus. You have an early fight against Vlad. It's all about winning those fights. What do you do later on? Well, once you've secured the border of the Empire, maybe helped out Kislev in some way, maybe dealt with their Azazel and fraud problem, to some degree, or at least one of them, helped them stabilize their front line, what do you do? Well, you can settle the mountains, you can settle temperate climate, so the same possibilities exist for you as they exist for Karl Franz. So the western border princes, you may want to deal with Scrag once you've dealt with Festus, march armies over here. Scrag tends to declare war on Everland and tends to also declare war on you. It's at this point that Karakern might become an issue. So just be aware while your armies are marching north that you don't leave yourself too exposed. You want to take down Festus, but you also don't want to sacrifice everything and leave your core territory exposed here in Saarland for Scrag to just show up and wreck it. Though, if Scrag does that, he's just committed suicide against you. If he sends an entire army against your territories and you beat it, that's the end of him. Belegar will show up, take him out, wipe him out. Ideally, that wouldn't happen because you would want this territory for yourself as opposed to Belegar having it. You could declare war on Belegar if you so desire, if you want to go against the lore, so to speak, and the lines between the Empire and Dwarves. And then you can, of course, expand south into the desert and into the jungle, because the jungle is a very suitable climate for you as well. But being able to colonize mountains does present you some options that are just not as workable for Karl Franz. You can still do them, but there's obviously downsides. To the west of Salland lies the Southern Grey Mountains. This is likely going to, a large portion of this is likely going to be taken over by Durfu. And you don't necessarily want to spark a very early war against Durfu, and crucially, he can bypass the mountain range through the underway, and while you, to attack him, will either have to go for here for 4 Sol, or to go for Helmgard in order to get to Alpha Loren. And if you end up in a war with Durfu, chances are you're going to end up in a war with the entirety of Alpha Loren. But this province, if you can secure it via diplomacy or military action, can be amazing. Because you can settle the mountains. There's 4 regions in here. It's fairly well protected from many factions, with the exception of the Wood Elves. So it can be a very, it can be the breadbasket of your empire in a lot of ways. I mean, Sylvania is better because it gives you that gold mine, and Ostermark is pretty good as well. But this one is a fairly safe province, and from there you can get a lot of units or get a lot of economic output from this particular province. Generally, Carrick Norn gets wiped out by Durfu fairly quickly in a campaign. So those are some of your options. And even for Karl Franz's plan, the plan that I laid out for Karl Franz, it can work better for you because you can take the mountains. So you can take the mountains over here with no penalty, and then you can take the jungle, even take Armbrow's expedition territory, Carrick Zorn, an extra gold mine over here. So all of this territory to the south, and unless we're talking about the Badlands, is yours for the taking. Like all of it. And then, yeah, of course, Celestria is also available if you decide to go down that path. While doing the same thing as Karl Franz in terms of stabilizing the north against Norska, helping out, maybe taking the Ice Tooth Mountains, then giving it to Kostaltin, Kislev in general. Finally, let's talk about Balthasar Gelt's benefits. He gets a benefit to hero capacity and upkeep for battle wizards. The upkeep benefit doesn't really matter. The hero capacity is pretty nice because otherwise you're spending quite a bit to get hero capacity for battle wizards. More crucially, though, he gives you 10 armor for all armies. So every unit has 10 more armor, vastly increasing their durability, and also making them better in terms of an auto-resolve chance. So the more armor you have, the more leadership you have, the better your odds at securing a victory in the auto-resolve with fewer casualties. So he turns, so your great swords can have 105 armor by default for every army in your faction. He also starts with the captain, which is very nice, and he's also a Lore of Metal wizard. There's more to this, of course. His own skill line, he gets extra armor. He gets 9 extra armor to his army. So units in his army are getting 19 extra armor. Then he gets an ammo and missile strength benefit for gunpowder infantry units. This is not especially great. I mean, it's good damage, but gunpowder units do suffer significantly. I'd prefer to use huntsmen over handgunners, even though handgunners could theoretically do more damage. It's just the issue of being able to get the shots off in the first place. Then you have the Luminarch benefit. This is pretty useless, I gotta say. Though you can benefit, of course, from that 20% missile strength from steam tanks. Those steam tanks are better as a tank as opposed to being a damage unit. If you're looking for steam tanks to do great damage, you're looking at it incorrectly. Steam tanks can be great at soaking up damage, on the other hand. Then he gets 2 extra hero capacity for battle wizards. So we're looking at 4 hero capacity for battle wizards. Very useful. You just need to get the structure. So you just need to construct a wizard's conclave. And with this, you will be able to get 5 battle wizards. Now, typically speaking, I would say you don't necessarily want more than 1 battle wizard per army. Like you could add a different wizard from a different school of magic to Gelt's army, just spice things up, or allow you to focus on building up Gelt's red line skill line, his special skill line, blue skill line, as opposed to his magic skill line. Just focus that battle wizard at first battle wizard you're getting on pure magic. Though Gelt does have a significant benefit, like his magic skill line is the best that you can get for an Imperial wizard. And he does have significant benefits in Lore Master, Lore of Metal, wins a magic power reserve, still. Then he gets +2 hero crew rank for battle wizards, faction-wide, and 10% missile strength for artillery. He also starts as the Electric Count of Solent. And that's great because you have the Eldred's Guards, Spearmen with Shields. There are a bunch of Electrostate troops, but these guys are actually really good early game to have because they have substantially more armor than regular Spearmen with Shields. They're just going to do a much, much better job. And having a bunch of these in your faction and being able to recruit them from the very start does give you an advantage when it comes down. Like the Karlberg Greatswords that Karl Franz can get, yes, they're pretty good, absolutely. No denying that, but they're not as big of an upgrade as the Eldred's Guard compared to regular. If we look at the stats of regular Spearmen with Shields, they're not such a major upgrade, like the Greatswords versus Karlberg, or like the Spearmen with Shields versus the Eldred's Guards, the State Troopers of Solent. Gelt, I think, works best. He doesn't have best of the two legendary lords that start an empire. He doesn't have that campaign movement range, nor does he have the Lord Recruit rank. Fair enough. But what he does have, in terms of that armor benefit, fairly substantial. Having 10 armor for all units gives you a significant advantage in every battle and makes up for a lot of the shortcomings that the Empire, or helps make up to a certain degree for the shortcomings that a lot of early game Imperial units, which you will be using a lot of in your campaigns when you're trying to build a lot of stacks, for a lot of the shortcomings that they do have. Furthermore, Gelt also has a major benefit, provided you don't lose it, and you really don't. He starts with a unit of great cannons. This is amazing for winning sieges, because one of the problems the Empire has is it takes until tier 4 to get effective artillery against fortifications. Unless you're Gelt, in which case you already start with effective artillery against sieges. And that is pretty great to have. Also, bear in mind, having 2 units of artillery in your starting army is great because each of these artillery units has siege attackers, meaning you can instantly attack a settlement, a walled settlement, provincial capital more likely, the moment you reach it. So you could actually take this artillery and give it to other armies so that they can instantly attack provincial capitals. Various ways of using them, but certainly a benefit to have this artillery advantage in Gelt's army. And also this captain from the very start. And that's all there is to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.